This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. One of the characteristic dimensions of the experience of being a young adult can be a strong feeling of what is right and what is good, and where there is tension or injustice or superficiality and hypocrisy. It can be a strong feeling sense for meaning and authenticity, alignment. And one of the things that can be difficult, which is a challenge, is to try to raise up these feelings and to have the courage to speak about them clearly and to think about them clearly. This is particularly the case today with any sense or feeling that we might have about the spirit or spiritual questions. And it's naturally the case. Today, no matter if we consider ourselves religious or spiritual, we live in a techno-scientific age. One that's dominated by really grandiose development of natural science and technology and materialism. And that makes us instinctively shy away from seriously thinking about the spirit and spirituality. And so it takes courage to be able to raise some of the feelings that we might have about the importance of thinking about the spirit in the human being and in the greater world, and raising these feelings up into clear thought. And today I'd like to take the Goetheanum, where I work, as an example of a possible question, articulation of a question. Now, the youth section, which is one department of the independent college or school of spiritual science, it is focused on working and creating opportunities and co-creating projects and opportunities with young people. And the age range is quite wide. It can be very young, in high school, to young people in their 20s at the time when they're studying, they're developing themselves. And I'd like to focus, because we're focusing on a college question, which the Goetheanum really sets itself in the landscape of universities and colleges, in young people who are maybe in their early 20s and who are looking for something in colleges and in communities of learning where they can develop themselves. They're looking for something particular. And how does the Goetheanum situate itself in this landscape of contemporary colleges and higher education? Now, I'd like to share some things, and of course it goes without saying that most of what I will share is going to be limited to examples from my own country or culture, the Anglosphere, transatlantic, and the United States in particular. And when we look at young people who are setting out in their early 20s and they want to study something, and they're particularly interested, let's say, in that mysterious and moving power that they can experience through art, through philosophy, through literature, through the mighty images of history and human history, that they might go to the university today and they might seek out particular disciplines, particular departments in what we would call the humanities today. And indeed, in German, the word for the humanities, roughly speaking, is Geisteswissenschaften. And Geisteswissenschaften, translated directly into English, is spiritual science or spiritual sciences. And a young person today going into the university, going into colleges, looking for a place where they can differentiate and deepen their experience and understanding of the wonders of, let's say, spiritual life, even as it just manifests itself through human writing and art and thought and history, they may be surprised that they find an approach to this discipline or this area of experience which doesn't necessarily align with what inspired them to want to learn. And indeed, they may find themselves not looking for a department in the humanities in the end, but looking into programs which might be called liberal contemplative studies programs or consciousness studies programs. And this is a remarkable kind of situation that young people may find themselves in when they go into universities today or into college settings. And it's connected to how the Goetheanum also might appear for young people. The Goetheanum, which is called the Independent College of Spiritual Science, how does it appear, or how can it appear as justified for young people who are looking to develop themselves today? Well, the fact that young people find this many places in the United States when they go to college and university curricula and program descriptions really can be traced back to a crisis in the university, in the Anglosphere, transatlantic Anglosphere, about 50 years ago. And at that time, huge protests and countercultural movement from students, and they would gather on the campuses, in some ways like the protests that are currently ongoing about the violence in the Middle East, and particularly in Gaza, but focused on issues of the Vietnam War at that time, on segregation and civil rights in the United States, and freedom of speech. But it's remarkable when we look back to that time, there was also a deep spiritual questioning that was very, very clearly evident in the student movements. And I'd just like to take one example of what came out of this crisis, or a moment of this crisis, which is when Mary Carolyn Richards was on a artist residency at a university in Canada. And during this residency, there were protests. This was in the early 70s, of students, and they were demanding of their teachers that when they went into the classroom and when they went into the lecture halls, that they wanted to have a kind of opportunity to learn which somehow involved more self-fulfillment or self-expression. And the university professors and the teachers were absolutely baffled by the demands of the young people and the fact that they felt so strongly that they had some right on self-fulfillment in coming to the university for education. And they asked, in their bafflement, they asked Mary Carolyn Richards, who was in a way one of the spokespeople for some of the new cultural characteristics that were emerging in the 60s, well known through her book Centering. They asked her if she might mediate or help to try to bridge the gap in understanding. And one of the things that she pointed out was, when the young people are saying self-fulfillment and self-expression in education, for an old ear, for a person who isn't listening deeply, they will just hear about a kind of spoiled expectation of a young person who doesn't really understand the demands of knowledge. And yet, what one hears if one listens deeply was that young people were protesting because they felt like through themselves participating, so self-expression or self-fulfillment, there was a kind of quality to knowledge of the world, not just of themselves or their personalities, that could come about, that could be connected to their feeling and their values, that they felt was lacking in the university classroom, in the university lecture halls. And they demanded poetry, more poetry in the lecture halls, for instance. They wanted something that had something more of a living spiritual quality in their education. And this is one of the demands or that we can see arising in the 60s and 70s on the university and college campuses in North America, for instance, in Canada and the United States, though also in Europe to some extent. And at the same time, we have a whole group of people who are looking at university, and they're not saying, yeah, there can be a deeper knowledge culture, one that reaches into the spirit. No, they're saying knowledge is actually not about understanding. In the end, knowledge is about power. And all knowledge, to really understand knowledge, we don't simply need to understand it through reading and discussion, but through looking how it distributes rights and duties and access or marginalization through the meanings that it creates. So taking our view away from kind of the field of pictures and intuitions and looking at the distribution of rights and duties and obligations in society. And that is really how we understand what knowledge is about. And of course, one of the preeminent articulators of this view of the crisis in the university was Michel Foucault, who understood himself as a student of Nietzsche, the great German philosopher. And when we look at the last 50 years and we see what the young person meets today when they go into the college or the university looking for this deeper path of knowledge, and they find now two different directions possibly. And certainly by far, I would like to suggest when they go into the humanities or out an interest in the spirit, even if it is understood just as the human spirit, they find the stream that is associated with Michel Foucault most strongly represented, without a doubt, namely literature, philosophy, art. To truly understand it is to see how it is connected to the exercise of power. And that is what they are also taught predominantly when they enter into their first classes in the humanities or the spiritual sciences or the mental sciences, some free translation there. And so they might no longer look for programs in the humanities, but instead look for programs in contemplative studies, look for programs in consciousness studies. They might look for other areas where a sincere interest and exploration of the spiritual life, not as a veiled exercise of political power, but as something that cannot be reduced to that. They might look for programs that can help them explore and understand that dimension of the spirit. And so this brings us back to the student protests and what was characterized by Mary Carolyn Richards, namely the demand for more intense inner participation and imaginative participation in college and universities so that knowledge is more connected to the heart and so that knowledge is more connected to human values and meaning. And there is, of course, a whole stream of groups and people who connected more with this interest over the last 50 years. And I would like to just highlight one and just focus on one, which is pertinent for this episode. And when we look back these last 50 years, we can see that in the 1970s already, of course, we find the radical experimentation with hallucinogens, Timothy Leary, Richard Albert, later Ram Dass. And we see that in some ways, this interest in spirituality is associated with this movement, which again also finds its way into the founding of Naropa College or Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado in the 1970s, where Ram Dass plays a very significant role, who was at Harvard with Leary. And when we look at that stream, this is one stream where there's a very clear focus and direction on spirituality. There are others, and in already out of circles of people who are interested in this, I guess, more surrendered and objective dedication to the understanding of the Spirit. We see, for instance, in 1995, through the Fetzer Institute and the Nathan Cummings Foundation, a working group which focuses on contemplative mind in society, which is connected to this interest in the transformative power of the Spirit in society. And in 1997, a center is founded out of this work, and it involves bringing together in colleges and universities conversations and research having to do with the power and role of meditation in higher education. Contemplative pedagogy, for instance. And by 2010, there are 100 colleges and 145 fellows who are in this network. And in 2004, Arthur Zients, who is involved in this founding, is appointed the director of academic program. And he also begins to work on something called contemplative epistemology. And in 2008, the contemplative mind in higher education is established. And we can see in this stream of work, and the people who gathered around this includes the Mind and Life Institute, people who are really interested in the transformative power of the Spirit and didn't think that it could be simply interpreted as veiled power in political processes of oppression. Now, if we look at this, I'd like to give two examples of what, for instance, are many, many examples. And by looking at the heart of higher education, which Arthur Zients and Parker Palmer were involved in putting together, you can find many other examples. But for instance, in one contemplative studies program, which has been around, one of the longer ones at this point, at Brown, there is a focus on first-person experience and accompaniment of the study of spiritual literature. This means that besides studying ancient spiritual texts, the student also engages in the practices that are described in the spiritual texts, out of also an understanding that the communities, to understand the communities of practice and what they were working with, it's not enough simply to analyze intellectually and critically the texts, because they were all also engaged as a community of practice. And so there are meditation assignments as well as reading assignments. There are other examples, for instance, one related to medical school, where a professor who had the duty or the task of leading the anatomy classes, which involved the dissection of the human corpse, which is something of an infamous experience for young medical students, because it can be very difficult to spend so much time with an anonymous cadaver or corpse of a human being. And it's also a time when many people leave medical school, and it can be somewhat of a shock. And one of the initiatives that that arose in this circle of people, but particularly in this department in Massachusetts in the United States, was that when a person donated their corpse to further education or medical studies, that they also wrote a letter about their intention and why they donated their body to, let's say, a university. And that before a student would then engage with exploring through dissection a human corpse, they would read the letter of the individual, the spirit, who lived through this body, and make a connection with them, and then receive the body in a way as a gift from that person. And to learn more about that, you can look directly at the description of the project in the Heart of Higher Education. These are two examples, and there are many examples also which contradict one another of what contemplative pedagogy is and of how to practice it. When we look, though, at Arthur Zients, who was a meaningful collaborator in this movement, he authored a book that is called Meditation as Contemplative Inquiry, When Knowing Becomes Love. And as already mentioned, one of the tasks that he set himself was to create a kind of conversation around the epistemology of contemplative life, or how does meditation relate to knowledge? And he comes to an epistemology of love, that through meditation, it's possible to develop kind of knowing which allows us selflessly to unite with other beings, other people, objects, and events. And this is very interesting to hold up next to knowledge as power. We have these two streams that kind of flow out of the 1960s and 1970s crisis in the university and colleges. A stream which leads to understanding knowledge as power, and a stream that leads to exploring knowledge as love. And we find them actually mostly in the humanities departments, in the case of postmodernism, knowledge as power, and in contemplative studies programs, in the example of knowledge as love. That is a grotesque simplification, but I want to kind of try to paint a bigger picture here. Now, where does the Goetheanum fit into this picture? A young person going out into the landscape of possible colleges, universities they might like to attend. And then there's this independent college for spiritual science. And it's interesting. It has many departments in different specialized fields. These are associated with training programs in pedagogy, agriculture, natural science, medicine, mathematics. And what do we find when we look at it a little bit more closely? Now we're turning to also having the courage to ask the question that we might sense or feel when we try to see what the Goetheanum is. And the Goetheanum was founded 100 years ago, so the establishment, I think, which in one way is totally justified to look at the Goetheanum not as the independent college for spiritual science, as it's often translated in English, but as the independent college for contemplative knowing, because it is oriented towards this meditative epistemology. And it has, besides these departments which are open in the movements of, for instance, the biodynamic agricultural movement, and the movement for educational renewal, it has a first class. And this first class is a kind of introduction to what we could call contemplative epistemology. And it consists actually in meditations. It is a series of meditations. And there are thousands of members of this first class all over the world. And one of the interesting things that we see when we see the kind of meditation coming into contact with the academy is that one of the big challenges is how can we work with meditation in a way that can unite with the virtues of the academy, which focuses in a lot of ways, the current academy, on critical thinking, analysis, reductionism, which are its greatest strengths without a doubt. But then we find that these might have an influence on the way meditation is integrated into the academy. But if we look at the interest that is very clear for 50, 60 years to turn towards the spirit as a source of meaning, and also with its own conditions that we would like to actually orient ourselves towards, one of the questions that naturally could arise, how could you create a college for contemplative knowing that was shaped and whose activities were not simply dictated by the critical thinking and analytic tradition of the university, but out of the demands of an epistemology of love? In Arthur Zience's book, Meditation as Contemplative Inquiry, he refers to a poem, the experience of knowing and understanding in poetry, referring to an Emily Dickinson poem, and how through cadence, through imagery and tone, we're able to have an experience of poetry from the perspective of beauty. Again, I'm not looking at a critical analysis of its power dynamics. Or he writes, quote, "Poetry demands that we respect its time organism. When reading fast, you may understand the lines, but the artistry is inaccessible. The time organism is violated. The poem is dead. Thought can move at lightning speed, but the art of the poem demands a slower tempo." And a few sentences later, he refers this to meditation. "Likewise, if we try to meditate fast, we remain outside the meditation, performing the mental actions, but with none of the requisite feelings and perceptions. In this sense, meditation is an art." End quote. If we can follow what Arthur Zience is characterizing there and sense its truth, one of the questions about the demands that have been voiced by young people for decades would be how to structure opportunities in higher education where the form is inspired by the conditions of the spirit. And when we look, for instance, at the Goetheanum as one example of a college that is 100 years old now, that is an independent college for what today might be called, now I'm referring to, again, to my context in the United States, an independent college for contemplative knowing. And the first class of this college is actually a series of meditations that are not treatises or principles, but through cadence, imaginative participation, tone, and imagery are offered as a path to develop in the direction of this epistemology of love. And if we look at one other characteristic of the Goetheanum, when it was founded, when we look at Rudolf Steiner and others who were there at its founding who were speaking about it, they did not refer to it as the initiative of an individual human being or a group of human beings, but as a school that had its life, its meaning, and significance out of the Spirit and its conditions. And here we see, to be able to ask that question, what does it mean for a college to be founded out of the spiritual reality, out of a spiritual reality, and not as solely as human initiative? And this is a question that it takes courage to ask and to think about, and which is bound up with the Goetheanum, but also with the deeper demands of young people from all over the world who have demanded this deeper dimension to knowledge for the past decades. Questions of Courage is a project of the youth section, and it's a collaboration with Goetheanum TV and the communications team. The production costs are quite small, but we would encourage you to give donations to support youth work in the youth section, even while these episodes are given out freely. We welcome very much so, and we are also in need of support of wide networks and associations of people who want to support this work. Thank you.